She was sitting in seat 24A. Drawing in her sketchbook. One AirPod in. Nobody noticed her. Nobody knew her name. 239 people on that plane had no idea that the quietest person on board was about to walk into the cockpit, grab the yoke, and leave the tower completely silent. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Flight 7742 was a Tuesday afternoon flight. A Boeing 737-800, wide enough that your elbows always touch the armrest of the seat next to you, tall enough inside that a tall person had to be careful standing up. It carried 239 passengers and a crew of 6 on a route from Toronto Pearson to Halifax Stanfield, a 2.5-hour hop across Ontario and Quebec and out over the cold grey water of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The weather briefing that morning showed some cloud over the Atlantic provinces but nothing serious. No ice, no wind shear, no reason to file any deviation. A routine flight on a Tuesday by a crew that had done this route dozens of times. 1 hour in, the aircraft was at cruising altitude, flight level 280, meaning 28,000 feet above sea level, and everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. The engines were running cleanly. The autopilot was holding the heading. The fuel load was where it should be. In the cockpit, Captain Roy Pemberton, 58, was drinking coffee and saying something about his daughter's football tournament. First Officer Claire Beaumont, 31, was half listening and checking a weather update on her tablet. Outside the windows, cloud moved slowly below like something breathing. In the cabin, a hockey team from a junior league tournament filled the back rows. They were loud in the comfortable way of young men who have just won something, half asleep, joking, hats pulled down over eyes. The front rows had the business travelers, laptops open, noise-canceling headphones on, already somewhere else in their minds. Families with young children sat in the middle section, which is where families always sit on short-haul flights, though nobody has ever explained why. The cabin smelled of recycled air and bad coffee and the particular staleness of a plane that has already made 2 trips that day. In seat 24A, window seat, left side of the aircraft, sat a girl. She was 17 years old. She wore a dark hoodie, hair pulled back, one AirPod in her right ear. The left ear was always open. That was a habit her father had taught her, and she had kept it without thinking about it, the way you keep habits that come from people you love. Her sketchbook was open on the tray table in front of her. She was drawing. Her name was Nadia Vasic. Nobody on the aircraft knew that name. She was, to everyone around her, simply the quiet girl in row 24 who drew things in a notebook. She was the least remarkable-looking person on the plane, which was exactly what she had always been. That had always been the wrong way to see her, but nobody on this flight would understand that for another hour and 12 minutes. What she was drawing was the instrument panel of a Cessna 172, a small single-engine airplane, the most common training aircraft in the world. She was drawing it from memory. Every gauge in its correct position. Airspeed indicator on the top left. Attitude indicator in the center. Altimeter to the right. Vertical speed indicator. Heading indicator. Turn coordinator. Each one placed exactly where it lived. She had been looking at that panel since she was 6 years old. Nadia Vasic grew up in Prince George, British Columbia, a city in the middle of the province where the winters are long and the sky is enormous. Her father was Captain Alexander Vasic, Sasa to everyone who knew him, a Serbian-Canadian bush pilot who had been flying remote routes in northern British Columbia and the Yukon for 22 years. He flew supplies to mining camps and medical evacuations from indigenous communities and sometimes just mail to places so far north that the only way in was by floatplane. He was not a famous man. He was a competent one, which is better. Nadia's mother had left when Nadia was 4. She did not remember very much about that. What she remembered was what came after, her and her father and the sky. From age 6 he had taken her flying, not as a passenger but as a student. He narrated everything, all the time. Weather reading. Fuel calculations. Radio procedure. Emergency protocols. What to do if an engine quits over water. What to do if the oil pressure drops. What to do if you are disoriented in cloud. He talked to her the way some fathers talk during baseball games, constant, easy, explaining everything without waiting to be asked. By age 10 she could do a full pre-flight inspection of a Cessna 172 faster than most adult student pilots. By 13 she had logged over 200 hours of supervised flight time, Cessna 172, Piper Cherokee, and her father's de Havilland Beaver floatplane, which he flew off the lakes north of Prince George and which smelled of aviation fuel and river water and something she had never been able to name but which meant safety to her. At 15, on a calm morning in early autumn, she had soloed a Cessna 172, over the fields north of town. Her father stood on the grass beside the runway and watched. He did not move. He did not breathe in any normal way. She took off, did one circuit, came back, and put it down on the centerline without a bounce. When she climbed out he was still standing in the same place. He walked over to her and put his hand on the top of her head, which was something he had not done since she was small, and he said, "Good." That was all. It was enough. She had never flown anything with more than one engine. She had never sat in a commercial jet cockpit. Her entire experience was in small propeller planes over empty country. But her father had told her something that she had heard so many times it had stopped being words and become something more like a belief: the aircraft doesn't care how big it is. It obeys the same physics. Lift is lift. Drag is drag. If you understand the principles, the size is just a number. She was traveling to Halifax alone to spend a week with her aunt while her father finished a contract up north. She had her sketchbook and her AirPods and a paperback novel she had already read twice. She had noticed Captain Pemberton when he boarded before the passengers, the way she always noticed pilots, the way he moved, slowly but with no wasted motion, like someone who had done this 10,000 times and let his body remember it so his mind could be elsewhere. She had thought, he's done this 10,000 times and it shows. Then she had gone back to her drawing. 1 hour and 12 minutes into the flight, at 14:36 local time, both pilots lost consciousness. There was no bang. No explosion. No dramatic decompression that sent masks dropping from the ceiling panels. What happened was quieter and, in many ways, more frightening than any of those things. The Boeing 737 uses a system called bleed air, hot, compressed air taken directly from the jet engines, to pressurize and heat the cabin. This is normal. Every airliner does it. The air is clean. But on Flight 7742, a seal inside the bleed air system had been failing slowly, in a way that did not trigger any obvious warning. The failure allowed trace amounts of combustion gas, including carbon monoxide, to enter the cockpit's air supply, mixed in with the pressurized air the pilots breathed through the aircraft's environmental control system. At cruising altitude, where the body is already working harder than usual because of reduced oxygen levels, even small amounts of carbon monoxide cause the blood to stop carrying oxygen properly. The brain begins to go. The process is insidious. One of the first things it takes is the ability to recognize that something is wrong. Captain Pemberton went first. There would have been no drama in it, just a heaviness, a warmth, a sense of nothing being urgent. His eyes would have stayed open for a while. He was a big man and it took a little longer. First Officer Beaumont noticed something was wrong with him and reached for the emergency oxygen mask above her seat, the supplemental oxygen that cockpit crews have for exactly this kind of situation, and she almost made it. The last thing she did was pull it a few inches from its housing. Then she was gone too. The aircraft continued flying perfectly. The autopilot did not know that its crew was unconscious. It held the heading, held the altitude, held the speed. It was doing exactly what it had been set to do. The 239 passengers in the cabin felt nothing unusual. Nobody noticed anything for 11 more minutes. Then Denise Okafor, a flight attendant with 17 years of experience, went forward to the cockpit for a routine check. She had done this walk hundreds of times, a knock, a code, a moment in the doorway to confirm everything was fine. She knocked. The door opened from her security code. She stepped in. She did not scream. She stood in the doorway for 3 seconds, taking in what she saw, and then she moved. She manually deployed the cockpit emergency oxygen masks onto both pilots, fitting them over their faces the way she had practiced in training, the way she had hoped she would never need to practice for real. She checked both pulses, both alive, both breathing. She looked at the instrument panel. The aircraft was straight and level. The autopilot was on. The numbers on the screens were stable. She understood all of this immediately, and she also understood that she had no idea what to do next and that someone on this aircraft had to. She picked up the PA handset. She pressed the button. And when she spoke, her voice was the calmest thing anyone would say on this aircraft for the next hour. Ladies and gentlemen, I need to ask if there is anyone aboard with any flight experience whatsoever. Any experience at all. Please come forward immediately. In seat 24A, Nadia Vasic heard the announcement. She removed her AirPod. She closed her sketchbook. She sat very still for 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, her father's voice came to her, not a memory of a specific moment but something more like a temperature. Emergencies don't wait for you to be ready. You decide, and then you move. She stood up. The walk from row 24 to the front of the aircraft took about 40 seconds. She felt every seat she passed. The hockey team went quiet as she walked by them, not because they knew anything but because something in the way she was moving made them stop. A businessman in row 8, laptop still open, looked up at her and said, "Sit down, kid." She did not pause. She did not look at him. She did not respond at all, which was more unsettling than any answer would have been. Denise Okafor saw her coming from the front galley. Her face did something complicated in the second before Nadia reached her, a flicker of something between relief and doubt. She had been expecting a retired pilot. Someone older. Someone with the look of authority that authority gives you when you've had it long enough. Instead she was looking at a 17-year-old girl in a dark hoodie with her hair tied back and her sketchbook under her arm. Nadia spoke first. Her voice was level. "I have 240 hours in single-engine piston aircraft. I've never flown a jet. But I understand aircraft systems and I can work a radio and I can help you manage this until we get someone on the ground who can talk us down. I'm not telling you I can land this plane. I'm telling you I'm the best option you currently have." Denise looked at her. 3 full seconds. Then she stepped aside. "The notes are the same. Everything else is different." She did not freeze. Nadia stepped into the 737's flight deck and stopped for exactly 1 second. The cockpit of a Boeing 737 is not large, but coming from a Cessna it feels like stepping from a single room into a cathedral. There were screens everywhere, the EFIS displays, electronic flight instrument system, the big glass screens that show altitude, speed, attitude, navigation, where a Cessna had round gauges. There were hundreds of switches on the overhead panel. The throttle quadrant in the center was massive, built for heavy hands. The yoke was the right shape but wrong in a dozen subtle ways. Both pilots were slumped in their seats, masks on their faces, chests rising and falling. It was like hearing music you knew, played by a full orchestra when you had only ever heard it on a single piano. The notes were the same. The physics was the same. The logic was the same. Everything else was different. She sat down in the right seat, the first officer's seat, and she found the radio. The radio, at least, was the same everywhere. She pressed the transmit button. Marcus Webb was 39 years old and had been an air traffic controller with NAV Canada for 12 years. He worked the Montreal Centre sector, which covered the airspace over Quebec and the Gulf of St. Lawrence, a large, busy piece of sky. He had handled emergencies before. Medical diversions. Lost communications. An aircraft that had declared a fuel emergency. He had never handled anything like what came through his headset at 14 hours 47 minutes and 23 seconds. The voice was young. It was shaking in the way that voices shake when the person knows that shaking will not help but cannot entirely stop it. But within the shake there was something precise, a deliberateness, a reaching for words that were the right words even if they came slowly. His training took over within 2 seconds. You trust the voice. You work with what you have. You keep them talking because silence is worse than anything. He asked 3 questions in quick succession. Could she read the altitude from the instruments? Was the autopilot still engaged? Were there any red warning lights on the panel? She answered all 3. Not vaguely. Specifically. Flight level 280. Altimeter reads 29.92. She knew what 29.92 meant. It is the standard pressure setting for altimetry, the number you dial in at cruising altitude. A person guessing would not have known that. A person who had been taught would have said it the same way she said it. He asked, have you ever flown an aircraft? She said, yes. Not this kind. Marcus Webb made a decision in 4 seconds that he would spend the rest of his career being asked about. He decided to trust her. He called his supervisor. He called the airline's operations center. He called Transport Canada's emergency coordination desk. He did all of this while keeping Nadia on the frequency continuously, because the worst thing that could happen right now was for her to be alone in that cockpit in silence. He talked to her the way you talk to someone on a ledge, steady, calm, like everything about this is manageable, even the parts that aren't. Within 8 minutes, they had located James Tran. James Tran was 61 years old and lived in a house in Montreal's Rosemont neighborhood with his wife and a vegetable garden he was unreasonably proud of. He had retired from Air Canada 14 months earlier after a career of 11,000 hours, most of them on the Boeing 737. He knew that aircraft the way a carpenter knows a good saw, not just what it does but how it feels in your hands, the sound it makes when something is right and the different sound it makes when something isn't. He was in his kitchen eating lunch when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. They patched him through to the radio frequency. He put in his earpiece and stood at his kitchen counter and heard, for the first time, the voice of the girl in the right seat. He said, Nadia. My name is James. I used to fly this exact aircraft for 22 years. I'm going to be honest with you, it's going to be hard. But the airplane wants to fly. It's doing most of the work already. Your job is to not fight it. Can you do that? She said, yes. He said, good. Let's start with what you already know. Tell me what you see on the attitude indicator. The aircraft is flying and wants to keep flying. A Cessna speaks in a whisper. This was the same language spoken much louder. But she had been taught to listen. Moncton came into sight through the broken cloud below, a city in its late afternoon light, the Pettit-Kodiak River catching the sun, the flat farmland spreading out around it, and in the middle of it all, the parallel lines of Moncton Airport's runway, its approach lights just beginning to glow in the fading afternoon. The airport beacon turned, white, green, the oldest signal in aviation, the one that says, here, land here. James Tran walked her through each step. Flaps to 15, the trailing edges of the wings extended, increasing lift at lower speeds, the aircraft's whole character changing slightly as they moved. Speed back to 180 knots. She eased the throttles back, the auto throttle was off now, everything manual, and felt the speed begin to come down. Then, gear down. The landing gear deploying on a 737 is an event. There is a sound like something enormous being woken up, a vibration that moves through the entire airframe, and then 3 heavy clunks as the main gear and nose will lock into place. In a Cessna, the gear, if it has retractable gear at all, makes a small business-like sound. This was entirely different. She held the yoke steady through it. She did not flinch. The runway was ahead. The approach lights, the rows of white lights leading to the threshold, stretched out in a straight line toward her. And there on the left side of the glide slope were the poppy lights, precision approach path indicator, for lights in a row that tell you whether you are too high, too low, or exactly right. 2 red and 2 white means you are exactly on the glide slope, exactly where you should be. 2 red. 2 white. Her father had taught her this. Sitting in the right seat of his beaver, watching the poppy at the end of a gravel strip somewhere north of Prince George, he had said, 2 red, 2 white. That's where you want to live. She had been 11 years old. She had not thought about that moment in years. It came back to her completely now, in full color, in his voice. At 500 feet above the runway, she felt something touch her right hand on the yoke. Captain Roy Pemberton had found enough consciousness to reach forward. He did not take the controls. He did not try to fly. He simply put his large hand over hers, the way you might put your hand on the shoulder of someone walking a difficult road, not to redirect them, just to be there. He said nothing. She did not look at him. But she felt it. The threshold passed beneath them. The landing was not smooth. A smooth landing would have been wrong, would have felt like fiction in a story that was true. The aircraft touched first on the left main gear with a hard, definitive bump that sent a jolt through every seat in the cabin. It settled onto the right main gear a half-second later, then the nose gear came down, and suddenly the aircraft was heavy in a way that flying aircraft are not, all 79,000 kilograms of it finding the ground and deciding to stay. The thrust reversers deployed, the engine nacelles opened and redirected engine thrust forward, the sound filling the cabin with a roar that some passengers later described as the most beautiful sound they had ever heard. The brakes engaged. The aircraft slowed, the deceleration pushing everyone forward into their seatbelts. The runway lights streaked by on both sides and then slowed and then stopped. The aircraft stopped moving. Nadia took her hands off the yoke. She looked at them. They were shaking, a fine, rapid tremor that she could not stop and did not try to stop. They had not shaken during the approach. They had held steady through the descent, through the gear extension, through the threshold, through the touchdown. They had waited until the aircraft stopped moving. Then they shook. Her father had told her this would happen. He had said it once, after her first solo, when her hands had shaken all through the debrief, "Your hands know when it's safe to fall apart." She had remembered it, and now she understood it completely. Denise Okafor's voice came over the PA. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have landed safely at Moncton. Please remain seated." That was all she said. It was enough. The paramedics were on the aircraft within 3 minutes. Captain Pemberton and First Officer Beaumont were taken off on stretchers, both conscious by the time they reached the terminal, disoriented, nauseated, but alive. In the ambulance, Captain Pemberton, who was alert enough to be embarrassed about being on a stretcher, asked the paramedic who had flown the approach. The paramedic told him. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the ceiling of the ambulance. Then he said, "Tell her she did good." Nobody told her individually. Everyone told her at once. The 239 passengers came off the aircraft into the Moncton terminal in the way that passengers do after something like this, not in the orderly file of a normal arrival but in a slow, dazed procession, some holding phones they weren't looking at, some blinking too much, some very quiet, some talking too much to compensate. The hockey team came off together, the older boys holding the younger ones at the shoulders the way people hold each other when they have been afraid and are now safe and don't quite know what to do with that. Nadia sat in a plastic chair in the terminal with a cup of tea someone had given her. She was not drinking it. She was drawing. The 737 instrument panel, from memory, every gauge in its correct position. A few people stopped and looked at her. Some said things. She heard them as if from a distance, the way you hear music from another room. Marcus Webb, the controller who had been her voice in that cockpit, drove 3 hours from Montreal without explaining to his supervisor exactly why. When he found her in the terminal he stood in front of her for a moment. Then he said, "You sounded scared." She said, I was scared. He said, you didn't sound it. She said, my dad taught me that scared and capable aren't opposites. He didn't say anything after that. He sat down in the next chair and they were both quiet for a while, which is sometimes the right thing. James Tran called her on her cell phone that evening. He was in his kitchen in Montreal, still in the same clothes he'd been wearing when his phone rang at lunch, his vegetable garden dark outside the window. Their conversation lasted 4 minutes. He said a few things that she would not repeat to anyone for a long time. The last thing he said was, I've talked to a lot of pilots in bad situations. You have something that can't be taught. You know what the aircraft is feeling. She said thank you. They said goodbye. She sat on the hotel bed for a while after she hung up. Her father was finishing a contract up north, and he landed back in Prince George at 11 o'clock at night. He saw the news on his phone while he was still on the tarmac, walking to his truck in the dark. He did not read the whole story. He read enough. He sat in his truck in the airport parking lot and he breathed for a while, in slowly, out slowly, the way he had taught her. He let a few minutes pass. Then he called. When she answered, he said her name once. Just her name. She said, I know, Dad. Neither of them said anything else for a long time, and neither of them needed to. The next morning she was at the hotel window at 6 o'clock, before the light had fully come up over the flat land east of the city. The airport was visible from the window, the runway lights still on, the ramp vehicles moving in the early gray, the terminal quiet at this hour. As she watched, a 737 taxied out from the gate, different airline, different aircraft, going somewhere entirely its own, and turned onto the runway and stopped for a moment. The engine spooled up. It began its roll. The nose lifted. The main gear lifted. The aircraft climbed into the pale morning sky, gear retracting into the belly, growing smaller and smaller against the cloud. She thought about every morning her father had woken her at 5 a.m. to drive to the airfield before school. Cold mornings when the Cessna's engine needed 3 tries to start and the cockpit was so cold you could see your breath. She thought about all the pre-flight inspections, walking around the aircraft in the dark, checking the fuel sumps, testing the control surfaces, checking the pitot tube cover, checking the tires, all the small careful checks that seemed like they were about that one flight but were actually about all the flights to come. She thought about all the hours in small cockpits over small towns, her father narrating everything, his voice the same whether they were over a calm lake or in a crosswind that wanted to push them sideways. She thought about how none of it had felt, at the time, like preparation for anything in particular. It had just felt like her life. That is the thing about careful, thorough preparation. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't say, you will need this on a Tuesday afternoon over the Gulf of St. Lawrence when you are 17 years old and 186 people need someone to not fall apart. It just builds, quietly, in the gap between who you are and who you might need to be, until the gap closes. Most of the people who save us are not famous. They are not, most of the time, even visible. They are the ones who paid attention when no one was watching, who learned things carefully and thoroughly not because they planned to need them but because they believed that knowledge was its own reason. They are the quiet ones in row 24 with one AirPod out and a sketchbook open, drawing something precise and careful and complete. Nadia picked up her sketchbook. She turned to a new page, blank and white in the early light. She began to draw the approach, the poppy lights in their positions, 2 red, 2 white, the runway spread out below like an answer, the way Moncton had looked under the broken cloud as the aircraft came down, the city lit and small and real, the river catching the last of the afternoon sun. She drew it the way she always drew everything, carefully, from memory, exactly as it was. Every detail in its correct position. Outside, the 737 lifted off the runway, gear retracting, climbing into the pale morning. She watched it until it disappeared. Then she went back to her drawing.